Let's start the discussion of topics in this course with a question that should be pretty obvious for you guys, assuming that most of you are psychology majors. And the question is, what is psychology? Now, people have some intuitive sense of what psychology is. I mean, you've known this because when you go to parties and people ask you what you study, you say, "Oh, I study psychology." And typically, they'll give you some sort of spiel about how you can read their mind and how you can help them with their problems and see everything that's wrong with it, so with them and so forth. So that's part of psychology, but psychology is much broader than that. Psychology is, if we want to define it, the study of behavior and mental functions. And note there that there are two parts to that already. It's behavior as a field of study, human behavior, and then mental functions that may give rise to that human behavior. Now, a more difficult question, given that we're at the start of this course, is what exactly is cognitive psychology? This is a more tricky question because it's only a subfield of psychology that most of you are not familiar with yet. So what exactly is it that cognitive psychologists do, think about, write about, and so forth? Well, it's pretty broad. It's the study of mental processes that allow us to perceive, remember, think, and act. So there's a lot in there because perceive, if we think about perception, well, what do we mean? We mean perception in terms of, if you're not blind, you can see the world and analyze it and make sense of what kind of shapes you're looking at, what kind of objects, where you're going, what kind of landscapes, people. That's all part of perception. That would be visual perception. There's also auditory perception. You're hearing my voice right now. You're decoding sound patterns into meaningful units of information, otherwise known as language. That starts with perception, auditory information coming into your ear. Perception is also touch and all the other senses we have. So perception actually is a wide range of different experiences. It's the input of our mental system, and with that input we can do all sorts of things. We can think about the input, we can remember some of it for future occasions. We can remember it in the sense that we can pull something out and make sense that what we're seeing now actually we've encountered before and we know what to do. We can use perception to think and then make decisions, and all of those decisions may ultimately require some sort of translation from our mental processes into some actual action. It being maybe, you reach for a coffee cup if you decided that you actually feel like drinking a cup of coffee. You decide to say something to your friend that maybe you shouldn't have said, or maybe you should, or you decide not to act. All the processes involved in all of those steps are part of what cognitive psychologists consider of interest within that field. So cognitive psychology, you may note, is not actually really concerned with helping people per se when it comes to their private problems. It's not about, what gives rise to your particular kind of depression and so forth. That would be clinical psychology. Cognitive psychologists do, however, help the broader population in the sense that a better understanding of, for example, memory may inform the development of more effective educational strategies, or how you can study better, or maybe perception. If we know more about perception, we can help people who have perceptual problems and actually make their everyday experience more palatable for them. Palatable maybe even if they have problems with taste, or maybe they have visual problems, and we help them develop some tools that they can actually deal with that. Cognitive psychology, really what we talk about in this course, is very much at the basis of these kinds of interventions, and we try to understand the basic processes involved in the mind and in behavior in order to then be able to say something useful about any of those circumstances that I just mentioned. So let's think about this, how complex a lot of our mental behavior actually is. So let's think about, back in the day when people would still go to this building called the library, and they would grab a book from the shelf and let's say they started to read the book. Well, what actually happens when you read a book? It seems like a very simple task, but if you break this down, there's actually a lot of different activities involved in reading. First of all, you need to look at the letters and then perceive them. Then you need to somehow make sense of them as strings that are actually connected to each other that then form words. Once you know what the words are, you then have to go and retrieve the meaning of those words. Once you have the meaning of the loose words, now you have to actually make some sort of mental image of the story as a whole to make sense of what the author is actually talking about. And then when you get to the end of the page, you actually have to be very diligent in turning the page with exactly the right amount of force between your thumb and your index finger, so that you don't apply too little force to turn the page. You don't apply so much force that you rip the page right out of the book. All of these sub-processes are actually extremely sophisticated, and they by and large set us apart from any other living organism on the planet still, as well as from artificial life. We've gotten pretty far in programming robots and so forth, but they have to be specifically programmed to do some parts of these activities here. We do these things all the time without actually really pausing and thinking about it very much. So that gives you some indication of the kinds of topics that we'll be covering. We'll start the course by talking about perception more. Then we'll move on and deal with, once we've taken in perceptual input, what do we decide to pay attention to and what do we sort of discard? Then, how do we query our memory? How do we store new memories? Are memories just one thing, or are there a set of different kinds of memories? How do we use our memory and our reasoning in order to make good decisions? How do we solve problems? How do we take our mental apparatus, our cognitions, and turn that into actual motor actions? Those motor actions include reaching and grasping and walking and getting up and so forth, but they also include language. How do we speak? How do we form sentences? How do we process sentences? And then also, what is the role of emotion in thinking, and how do these sorts of things interact? So that gives you some broad first indication of the kinds of topics we'll be talking about. Now, we'll look at that from a bunch of different angles, ranging from development to just healthy cognition, to problems with cognitive functions, to neurological disorders, to the neuroscience of any of these processes, and we'll touch on all of those. So that should give you a first sense of where this course is going to go.